Emma, we need to talk about your spending problem. Those were the words that hit me the moment I walked into my parents' living room that Tuesday evening, and I knew immediately that something was very wrong. I'd driven 40 minutes from my condo in the city to their house in the suburbs for what I thought was just a regular family dinner, the kind we had once a month when everyone's schedules aligned, but the scene that greeted me was nothing like the casual gathering I'd expected. My father stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, wearing the stern expression I remembered from childhood lectures. My mother sat perched on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands in that nervous way she had when something was bothering her. My oldest brother, Jake, 33 and a corporate lawyer who'd always carried himself with an air of superiority, occupied the leather armchair like he was presiding over a courtroom. My other brother Marcus, 31 and an accountant with one of the big firms downtown, sat beside his wife Bethany on the love seat, both of them watching me with expressions that mixed concern and something else I couldn't quite identify. Pity, maybe. The chairs were arranged in a circle, an actual circle, like something out of a bad television drama. I stood there in the doorway with my purse still on my shoulder and my car keys in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing, and that's when understanding crashed over me like cold water. This wasn't a family dinner. This was an intervention. Your lifestyle, honey, my mother added, her voice taking on that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying very hard to sound reasonable. We've all been worried about the designer bags, the trips you keep posting on Instagram. I felt my stomach drop as I looked from face to face, seeing the same expression on all of them, that mixture of concern and judgment that made my skin prickle with embarrassment and confusion. We're not trying to attack you, Jake said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in that practiced way he probably used with difficult clients. We're trying to help you before this gets worse. Marcus nodded in agreement. We think you might be living beyond your means, Em. It's nothing to be ashamed of. A lot of freelancers struggle with financial management. Freelancers. The word hung in the air with all the weight of their dismissal. The same dismissal I'd felt for 7 years since I'd graduated with my degree in graphic design and told them I was starting my own business. To them, I wasn't a business owner. I was a freelancer, someone who didn't have a real job, someone who worked in her pajamas and called it a career, someone who needed her successful brothers and their practical parents to stage an intervention about spending money they'd never once asked if I actually had. I walked slowly to the empty chair they'd left for me, the one that faced all of them, and I sat down without saying a word, my mind racing as I tried to understand how this had happened, how my own family could be sitting here ready to lecture me about my life without having asked me a single question about what that life actually looked like. My father cleared his throat and pulled his phone from his pocket, and I watched as he swiped through screens before turning it toward me with an expression that somehow managed to combine concern with vindication. We have evidence, Emma, he said, and I saw my own Instagram feed displayed on his screen. Photos I'd posted over the past 6 months arranged in what I suppose he thought was a damning collection. There was the sunset photo from my balcony in Bali, the picture of my new Celine bag on the cafe table in Paris, the snapshot of the prix-fixe menu from that Michelin-starred restaurant in New York. My mother leaned forward, her hands still twisted together in her lap, and added, Honey, you declined to contribute to the family cruise last month, but according to your posts, you can afford to go to Bali? The hurt in her voice might have touched me if I hadn't been so stunned by the casual violation of having my family screenshot my social media to build a case against me. Jake shifted in his chair, adopting that particular tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable and patient, the one that made my teeth clench. Em, we're trying to help you before you ruin your life. Credit card debt can spiral out of control faster than you think. I opened my mouth to respond, to explain, to defend myself, but my mother was already continuing. The designer sunglasses, sweetheart. I saw you wearing Chanel sunglasses at the 4th of July barbecue. Those cost what, $400? 500, Bethany corrected helpfully, and I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and something else, something darker that was starting to coil in my chest. And those boutique fitness classes, my mother pressed on. Sarah's daughter takes classes at the same place. She says they're $45 per session. I tried again to speak, managed to get out, "I can explain," but Marcus was already talking over me, his accountant's brain clearly having calculated what he thought were my expenses. "Emma, I'd be happy to sit down with you and go over your finances. We can set up a realistic budget, maybe look at debt consolidation options if you're in too deep." The words "in too deep" hung in the air like an accusation. Bethany, who'd been mostly quiet until now, added her own contribution to what was rapidly feeling like a pile-on. "And I have to say, Emma, it hurt that you only sent gift cards for the boys' birthdays last year. I know you think those designer bags are important, but your nephews deserve more than a $25 Amazon card." I felt something crack inside my chest, some protective shell I'd built up over years of these small dismissals, because the gift cards had been $50 each, not 25, but she hadn't even checked before using them as ammunition. My father was talking again about the exclusive restaurant, how his colleague had seen me there and mentioned the entrees started at $200. And how could I justify that kind of spending when I clearly wasn't making enough to sustain it? "You never show up for family obligations anymore," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You missed your cousin's wedding, you skipped your grandmother's birthday dinner, but somehow you have time for spa days and weekend trips." Every attempt I made to explain was met with another accusation, another piece of evidence they'd collected, another concerned observation about my lifestyle. Marcus circled back to his offer, making it sound less like a suggestion and more like an inevitability. "I really think we need to look at your accounts, Em. This is what I do for a living. Let me help you." Then my mother delivered what felt like the final blow, her voice soft and sad in a way that made everything worse. "Honey, we think maybe you should consider moving back home for a while. Just until you get back on your feet, you could save money on rent, and we could help you get back on track." Back on track. As if I were a train that had derailed, as if my life were a disaster that needed their intervention to fix, as if I were still a child who needed her parents to manage her choices. I sat in that chair facing all of them, silent now as they continued to talk about me, their voices overlapping in a way that made me feel like I wasn't even in the room, like I was some kind of problem to be solved rather than a person sitting 3 feet away from them. And something about that feeling, that sensation of being discussed rather than addressed, sent my mind spiraling back through years of memories I'd tried very hard not to dwell on. I thought about being 8 years old and bringing home a painting I'd done in art class that my teacher had praised, how I'd been so excited to show my parents, and how my father had glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before turning back to Jake's report card, back to the straight A's that mattered, back to the achievements that counted in this family. I thought about my high school art show, the one where I'd had 3 pieces selected for the advanced exhibition, a genuine honor that my teacher said happened maybe once every few years, and how I'd asked my parents weeks in advance to come, had reminded them a dozen times, had circled the date on the kitchen calendar in red marker. Jake's law school graduation party had been the same weekend, 3 hours away, and I understood that was important, I really did. But the graduation ceremony was on Saturday, and my show was Friday evening. And when I'd suggested maybe they could come to my show and then drive up Saturday morning, my mother had looked at me like I'd asked her to choose between her children, like I was being selfish for even suggesting that my art show might matter as much as Jake's milestone. They'd missed it entirely, both of them. And when I'd come home that night with the ribbon I'd won for Best in Show, my mother had been packing for the trip and had said, "That's wonderful, sweetie," without even looking up from the suitcase. The pattern had continued through college, through every small victory I'd tried to share, through the launch of my business when I'd been terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. I remembered sitting at family dinner 5 years ago, just after I'd landed my first major client, a boutique hotel chain that wanted a complete rebrand, my first project that would pay more than $10,000. And I'd been so proud, so ready to finally prove that my degree hadn't been a waste, that my choice to start my own business wasn't the disaster they all seemed to think it was. My father had listened to maybe 30 seconds of my explanation before he'd literally laughed and said, "Artists don't make money, Emma. That's just a fact." And then he'd launched into a story about some friend of his whose daughter had gotten a marketing job at a real company, emphasis on real, and wasn't that a smarter way to use a creative degree? I'd offered to redesign my mother's medical office 6 months ago, had presented her with a full proposal and mood boards, had been excited to finally do something for her that would let her see my skills firsthand, and she'd smiled that patient smile and said she needed someone with corporate experience, someone who understood professional spaces, and then she'd hired a firm without telling me. I'd found out only because I was the creative director they'd assigned to the project. And I'd sat in that first meeting watching my own mother fail to recognize my work, watching her nod along as my project manager presented concepts I'd stayed up until 3 in the morning developing. And when I'd waived my fee at the end, and the firm had told her one of their directors had donated their time, she'd never even asked why, never even wondered if maybe that director had been her daughter. Christmas 2 years ago, my brothers had each received checks for $5,000. Money my parents said was to help with their futures, with Jake's plan to buy a house and Marcus's investments, and I'd received a $100 Visa gift card with a note that said, "For art supplies," like I was still a child playing with crayons. I'd been 27 years old, had already banked over $400,000, and they'd given me a gift card for art supplies. I found my voice finally, cutting through the continued discussion of my supposed financial irresponsibility with a single question that somehow managed to quiet the entire room. "Can I ask what brought this on specifically?" My father looked at me like he was relieved I was finally engaging with what they considered reality, and he explained that their neighbor, Tom something, had mentioned seeing me at Alinea last month, and did I know that place had a $300 prix-fixe menu, and Tom had been concerned enough to mention it because he knew my family worried about me. My mother added that her friend Patricia had been on the same flight to Portland 2 weeks ago and had seen me in business class, and Patricia had very sweetly asked if everything was okay financially, if maybe I'd used miles or gotten some kind of upgrade because she knew I was still finding my footing career-wise. I watched Jake and Marcus exchange a look, that particular expression of concerned older brothers who thought their little sister was in denial about her problems, and Jake leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, using that same gentle, condescending tone I'd heard him use with hostile witnesses when I'd watched him in court once. "Emma, the first step is admitting you have a problem. We're not here to judge you, we're here to help." I felt something crystallize inside me then, some final thread of patience or hope or whatever had been keeping me silent finally snapping clean through, and I asked in a voice that came out calmer than I felt, "Did any of you think to actually ask me about my financial situation before staging this intervention?" My father spread his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to be reasonable. "Emma, sweetheart, we can see it. You're living a lifestyle you clearly can't afford. The evidence is right there on your Instagram, in the places people see you, in the things you buy." Marcus jumped back in with his offer, his accountant's brain probably already calculating payment plans and debt consolidation strategies. Let me review your finances professionally. No judgment, I promise. I just want to help you see the reality of where you are so we can make a plan to get you out of this hole." I reached into my bag, that expensive leather tote they'd probably mentally added to my list of irresponsible purchases, and pulled out the folder I'd actually brought for an entirely different reason, setting it carefully on the coffee table between us. My mother looked at it with something like dread, and I heard her ask quietly, "What's this? Credit card bills?" I opened the folder with steady hands, even though something was shaking inside my chest, and said, "I came prepared for a family dinner, but since this is an intervention, maybe you should see exactly what you're intervening about." The confusion on their faces might have been funny in any other context, might have been something I'd laugh about later, but right then I just felt tired and hurt, and something else. Something that felt like the moment before you step off a high dive, that split second of commitment before the fall. I pulled out the first document, my primary checking account statement from the bank I'd been with since college, and slid it across the table toward my father. He reached for it with that same dismissive confidence he'd had all evening, starting to say, "Emma, we're not trying to shame you, but you need to face." And then he stopped mid-sentence, his mouth literally hanging open, his hand beginning to tremble just slightly as he stared at the numbers on the page. My mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp with concern. "What? What is it? How bad is it?" But my father couldn't seem to form words, could only stare at the statement in his hands like it was written in a language he didn't quite understand. And I watched his face change completely, watched the patronizing concern drain away and get replaced by something else entirely, something I couldn't quite read. And the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, could hear someone's breath catch, could hear the moment my entire family's understanding of who I was began to crack apart. Marcus grabbed the statement from my father's trembling hands with the quick, analytical movement of someone who spent his days reading financial documents, and I watched his eyes scan the page with that particular focus accountants get when they're processing numbers. Watched his expression shift from concern to confusion to something that looked almost like disbelief, his mouth opening slightly as he reached the bottom line, and Jake demanded from his seat, "What? How bad is it?" His voice carrying that edge of concern mixed with the tiniest hint of satisfaction, like he was already preparing his lecture about fiscal responsibility, already mentally drafting the payment plan he'd help his irresponsible little sister create. Marcus looked up at me, and I saw him struggling to form words, saw him glance back down at the paper like he needed to confirm what he'd just seen, and he said quietly, slowly, "Emma, this shows a balance of—" But he trailed off like speaking the number out loud might somehow make it less real, and I decided to help him, keeping my voice calm and level, even though something was racing in my chest. Something that felt like vindication and grief mixed together in equal measure. $847,000, I said, letting each word land separately, letting them hear the reality of it. "That's my checking account. Want to see savings?" The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, like everyone had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe, and I reached into my folder again, pulled out another statement, this one from my savings account, and slid it across to join the first. My mother's voice came out as barely a whisper, her hand reaching out to touch the paper like she needed physical confirmation. "That can't be right. That's nearly $1 million." I watched her look at the savings statement, watched her see the balance of $1.2 million, and my father shook his head sharply, definitively, like he could negate reality through sheer force of will. "This is a mistake. Some kind of error. Banks make errors." I felt the weight of every dismissal, every casual put down, every concerned comment about my future, all of it flooding back through me in a wave that felt both painful and cleansing, and I watched their faces as they struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with the version of me they'd constructed in their minds. The Emma, who couldn't possibly be successful because she worked in sweatpants and called herself an artist. Jake leaned forward, and I heard the shift in his tone, that lawyer's suspicion creeping in as he asked, "Emma, where did this money come from?" And the implication in his voice, the suggestion that maybe this was somehow illegitimate or suspicious, sent a flash of genuine anger through me that I had to work to keep from showing on my face. "My work," I said, keeping my voice steady even though I wanted to throw the words at him. "The career you've all been worried about for the last decade. The job you've been telling me to quit so I could get something real." Bethany spoke up from her corner of the couch, her voice carrying that same bewildered tone. But graphic designers don't make this kind of money. That's just not, that's not realistic. I pulled out another document, this one a summary sheet I'd prepared for a meeting with my financial advisor. A clean list of my active and recent contracts with identifying details removed but scope and value clearly marked. You're right, I said, and I watched Bethany's expression start to shift toward vindication before I continued. Graphic designers typically don't make this kind of money, but creative directors and brand consultants with exclusive client lists do. I slid the contract summary sheet across the table to join the bank statements, and I watched Marcus pick it up with those careful hands accountants develop, the ones that treat every document like it might contain something crucial, and I started explaining what none of them had ever asked about, what they'd never been curious enough or interested enough to explore. I started freelancing right after college, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Like I was telling someone else's story, someone whose family had actually wanted to hear about her work. I built my portfolio doing small jobs, local businesses, a few nonprofits. It took 3 years of 60-hour weeks and living on nothing. But I built something. I watched my father open his mouth, probably to say something about those being the struggling years he'd warned me about. But I kept going before he could interrupt, before he could reframe my success story into something that validated his doubts. 3 years ago, I landed my first major client. A tech startup in San Francisco needed a complete rebrand before their Series B funding round. The project paid $85,000. I let that number sit there for a moment, watched my mother's eyes widen slightly, watched Marcus glance back down at the contract sheet like he was confirming what I'd said. They referred me to another company, and that company referred me to another, and that's how it works in my industry. Word of mouth, reputation, results. I pulled out another sheet, this one showing my current rate structure, the numbers I charged that would have seemed impossible to that 22-year-old version of me working 16-hour days in a studio apartment. I now charge between $50,000 and $150,000 per project, depending on scope and timeline. I typically handle 8 to 12 projects a year. My father's voice cut through, and I heard that same bewildered tone, that same inability to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. But you work from home in sweatpants. I've seen you on Zoom calls in a hoodie. I felt something that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder caught in my throat, and I nodded slowly. Yes, I work from home, usually 50 to 60 hours a week, sometimes more when I'm on deadline. The hoodie you saw? I'd been working for 14 hours straight on a presentation for a client who paid me $120,000 for 6 weeks of work. I thought about all the times I'd mentioned being busy, all the times I'd declined family events because of work and been met with that particular kind of dismissal, that implicit suggestion that whatever I was doing couldn't possibly be as important as a real job with an office and a dress code. My mother's question came quietly, and I heard something in it that might have been genuine confusion or might have been the beginning of understanding. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't we know about any of this? I felt my voice shift then, felt emotion creeping in around the edges of the careful calm I'd been maintaining, and I looked at her directly. I tried. For years, I tried. I remembered sitting at this same dining table 3 years ago, remembered the excitement I'd felt when I landed that tech company rebrand, remembered starting to tell them about it over Sunday dinner, and I remembered watching my father's attention drift to Jake, remembered him interrupting my story to ask Jake about some case he was working on, remembered the message that sent about whose work mattered, whose achievements deserved attention. You never asked, I said, and I heard my voice crack slightly on the words. When I mentioned work, you'd pat my head like I was still 7 years old and ask when I was going to get a real job. Jake shifted forward, and I heard defensiveness creeping into his voice. That's not fair, Emma. We were concerned about your stability. I reached back into my folder and pulled out my tax return from last year, the official IRS documentation that Marcus would recognize and respect in a way he hadn't respected anything else I'd said, and I slid it across to him, watched his eyes go straight to the bottom line the way accountants' eyes always do. $892,000, I said. That was my income last year. I watched Marcus stare at that number with the professional understanding of exactly what it meant. What kind of business generated that kind of revenue? What kind of client base supported those numbers? And I continued speaking into the silence that had fallen over the room. Those trips you saw on Instagram? The ones that concerned you so much? Business research and client meetings with vacation days attached, tax deductible. I ticked off items on my fingers, letting each one land. The $200 dinners, client entertainment, also deductible. The business class flights? Necessary when I'm flying to pitch six-figure contracts and I need to arrive ready to present instead of cramped and exhausted from coach. My father's voice came again, still struggling, still grasping at the inconsistencies between his version of me and the reality sitting in front of him in the form of financial documents that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. But you said you couldn't contribute to your mother's birthday cruise. You said you couldn't afford it. I felt my expression change then, felt something hardening in my chest, and I met his eyes with a directness I hadn't allowed myself before tonight, before this intervention had forced everything into the open where it couldn't be ignored anymore. I said I couldn't come on the cruise, I said, and I felt my voice shift into something harder, something that had been compressed under years of misunderstanding and willful ignorance. Not that I couldn't afford it. My mother's face showed genuine confusion, like she was trying to understand a distinction that seemed meaningless to her, and she asked, "What's the difference?" And I felt something break open in my chest, all the specific moments of dismissal flooding back with crystalline clarity. The dates you chose were when I had 3 client presentations scheduled, I explained, keeping my voice level even though memories were rising up like a tide I couldn't hold back. 6 months of work, 3 different Fortune 500 companies, combined value of over $400,000. I asked if we could move the cruise 1 week earlier or 1 week later, and you told me. I stopped, looked directly at my mother, watched her face as she started to remember the conversation, started to realize what she'd said. You told me that if family was a priority, I'd make it work. That successful people make time for what matters. The irony of those words sat heavy in the air between us, and my father shifted forward like he was going to defend the decision, going to explain why I should have just rescheduled my work, and he said, "You could have moved the client meetings, rescheduled them." And I felt years of this same conversation, this same fundamental disrespect for my professional life, crystallize into a single moment of clarity. "Would you ask Jake to reschedule a trial?" I asked, turning to look at my father directly. "Would you ask Marcus to skip April 15th because there was a family vacation planned?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but I continued anyway, working through the other accusations they'd thrown at me during this intervention. The other examples of my supposed irresponsibility and selfishness that had actually been them completely misunderstanding my life. "The nephew's birthdays," I said, turning to look at Bethany now, watching her shift uncomfortably in her seat like she already knew what I was going to say. "I sent $500 checks to each boy. You texted me that it was impersonal, that I should have come shopping with you for gifts instead, that the money felt like I was just trying to buy my way out of actual involvement." Bethany's discomfort increased visibly, and I kept going because this needed to be said, needed to be laid out in all its painful specificity. "And Mom's office redesign," I continued, turning back to my mother, watching her face change as she sensed where this was going. "I offered to do it for free. A complete rebrand, new website, all the marketing materials. I told you it would be my gift to you, that I wanted to help." My mother's expression shifted toward something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and I pulled out another document from my folder, a project summary from a firm I'd contracted with on several jobs, and I slid it across to her. You said you needed someone with corporate experience, someone who understood professional office design. You hired Fletcher and Associates. I looked them up after you mentioned it because I know the firm. I've worked with them before. I watched my mother pick up the paper, watched her scan down to the project team listing, watched her see my name listed as creative director on her own project. You paid them $40,000. I was the creative director they assigned to your project. I waived my fee when I saw the client name was your practice, thought it would be a nice surprise to be involved even if you hadn't hired me directly. My voice cracked slightly on the next words, the hurt of this particular dismissal cutting deeper than most because it had been so direct, so immediate. You never recognized me in the meetings. 3 meetings over 2 months, and you never once realized it was me presenting the concepts, me showing you the designs. You never asked about my work, never visited my office, never showed enough interest in what I do to recognize it when you were sitting across a conference table from me. I watched my mother's face cycle through shock and realization and shame, watched her hand tremble slightly as she held the paper. And I felt tears threatening at the edges of my vision, but refused to let them fall, refused to break down when I needed to finish this, needed to make them understand the full scope of what they'd missed. I've been successful for 5 years, I said, and my voice was thick with emotion I could no longer completely suppress. 5 years of building something real, something significant, something I'm proud of. And not once did any of you notice. Jake started to speak, his lawyer instincts kicking in to mount some kind of defense, and he said, "Emma, we didn't know." But I cut him off because I'd heard enough excuses, enough justifications for their blindness. "Because you didn't ask," I said, and the words came out sharp and final. "Because my work wasn't real to you. Because what I do didn't fit your definition of success. Because you'd already decided who I was and what I was capable of, and nothing I did could change that picture you'd created." I reached back into my folder because I wasn't done yet, wasn't finished showing them exactly how wrong they'd been, exactly how much they'd missed while they were busy worrying about my supposed irresponsibility and lack of direction. I started spreading the remaining documents across the coffee table the way a lawyer might lay out evidence in a case, each piece of paper another fact they'd missed while they were busy constructing their narrative of my irresponsibility. And I watched their eyes track from one statement to the next as the full picture of my financial life materialized in front of them. The investment portfolio statement showed $600,000 in diversified holdings, stocks and bonds and index funds that I'd been building systematically for 4 years, the kind of careful wealth management that Marcus did for his clients, but had apparently never imagined his little sister capable of executing. The retirement account statements showed $380,000 across 2 accounts, the kind of nest egg most people didn't accumulate until their 40s or 50s. And I was 29 years old with more saved for retirement than my parents had after decades of work. The property document was maybe the most significant, the deed to my condo showing that I owned it outright, no mortgage, $520,000 in equity that I'd paid in cash 3 years ago when I'd had what my family thought was just a particularly long stretch of unemployment, but was actually me closing 4 major contracts in 6 months and deciding to secure my housing permanently. I let them absorb the numbers, let Marcus do the math in his head the way I knew he would, his accountant brain automatically tallying assets and calculating net worth. And I watched his face change as he reached the total, as he understood what he was looking at. "Emma," he said, and his voice carried a weight I'd never heard from him before, a kind of professional respect that cut through the family dynamics into pure acknowledgement of financial reality. "You're wealthier than all of us combined." I nodded slowly, letting that truth settle over the room like snow, cold and complete and undeniable. And my father's voice came confused and grasping, still trying to reconcile this reality with the version of me he'd constructed. "I don't understand. You drive a Toyota." The absurdity of that statement, the idea that my car choice was somehow evidence against my success, rather than evidence of my values, almost made me laugh, and I kept my voice level as I responded. A paid-off Toyota, because I don't need to prove anything with a car. My mother was looking at the property deed, and I could see her trying to remember the one time she'd visited my place, the quick tour she'd given it before dismissing it from her attention, and she said, "Your apartment is nice, but not," and trailed off, because she was realizing mid-sentence that she'd never actually looked at it carefully enough to assess its value. "Not showy," I finished for her. "I bought it cash 3 years ago. You came once, said it was cute, and never asked any questions about how I could afford a place in that neighborhood or why I wasn't paying rent anymore." I felt the weight of years of invisibility pressing down on me, all the times they'd been in my space and never really seen it, never been curious enough to wonder about the details of my life. Jake was recovering now, his lawyer instincts kicking in to find some explanation that made sense of their complete misreading of my situation, and he asked, "Why didn't you correct us? Why let us think you were struggling?" And I felt anger flare hot in my chest at the question because it ignored everything I'd been trying to tell them. "I did try to correct you, dozens of times. You corrected me back, told me I was being overly optimistic about my income, told me to be realistic." I reached into my folder one more time and pulled out a printed email from 2 years ago, one I'd saved not because I'd planned for this moment, but because it had hurt so much that I'd needed to keep it as proof that I wasn't imagining the dismissal, wasn't being oversensitive about their lack of faith. "I sent you all this email about landing a major contract. Read Dad's response." I watched my father take the paper, watched him see his own words reflected back at him in black and white. And I recited them from memory because they'd burned themselves into my mind. "That's nice, honey. Don't forget most small businesses fail. Keep your expectations manageable." The shame on his face was visible and painful to witness, but I couldn't spare him from it, couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own dismissal. "I stopped sharing because it hurt less than watching you dismiss every achievement," I said, and Bethany's voice came small and confused, still not quite grasping the fundamental misunderstanding they'd all participated in. "The designer bags and trips, we thought you were in debt." I stood up then because I needed to move, needed the physical action to contain the emotion that was threatening to spill over, and I looked at each of them in turn as I delivered the final truth. "You saw what you expected to see. Irresponsible Emma, living beyond her means, the flighty creative who couldn't handle real adult life." I started pacing again because standing still felt impossible with everything rising up inside me, all the years of small dismissals and casual cruelties accumulating into this moment where I finally had their attention, but wasn't sure if it would matter. Wasn't sure if seeing my bank balance would actually change how they saw me, or just change how they treated me temporarily until they forgot again. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I asked, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, thick with emotion I'd been holding back through all the financial revelations and careful explanations. They were all watching me now with expressions that ranged from shame to confusion to something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and I felt the need to make them see past the numbers, past the shock of my success, to the deeper wound that had been festering for years. "It's not that you thought I was bad with money. It's that you all immediately believed the worst." My mother started to speak, her voice taking on that placating tone she used when she wanted to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem, and she said, "We were concerned." But I cut her off because I was done with euphemisms, done with their concern that was really judgment dressed up in nicer words. "You were judging. There's a difference." I stopped pacing and turned to face them fully, and the memories were flooding back now. All the other times they'd assumed my failures, all the other moments when they'd looked at my life and seen disaster where there was actually just a path they didn't understand. "When I took 2 weeks off last year, do you remember what happened?" I watched recognition flicker across Jake's face, and I continued before he could try to reframe it. You all started having subtle conversations about job hunting, sending me links to administrative assistant positions and office manager openings, asking if I'd thought about going back to school for something more practical. The humiliation of those conversations came back fresh and sharp, the way they'd circled around me like I was a problem to be solved. And I saw my father shift uncomfortably because he'd been the one to send me a listing for a receptionist job at his friend's dental practice. I wasn't unemployed. I was recovering from burnout after completing 4 major projects in 3 months, over $600,000 in combined billings, working 70 and 80-hour weeks to meet deadlines. I turned to Bethany now because she'd been particularly judgmental about my appearance at family events, always making little comments about effort and presentation that seemed caring but were actually criticisms. And Christmas, when I showed up in jeans and a sweater, and you made that comment about dressing appropriately for family occasions, about showing respect through appearance. Bethany's face flushed because she remembered exactly what she'd said, and I watched her realize that I'd heard it as the insult it was, not the helpful advice she'd pretended to offer. I came straight from a 14-hour work session because I was finishing a year-end project that couldn't be delayed, and I still showed up because family was important to me even when I was exhausted, even when I probably should have stayed home and slept. Jake tried to mount some kind of defense, his lawyer instincts pushing him to argue even when he must have known the ground was unsteady beneath him, and he said, "You have to admit, you're not exactly forthcoming about your life." And I wheeled on him because that particular accusation cut deep. The idea that my privacy about my success was somehow the same as their assumption of my failure. I learned not to be. "Do you remember what you said when I graduated?" I watched his face carefully, watched him try to remember, and then try to pretend he didn't. And the silence stretched between us until I supplied the memory he didn't want to claim. "You said good luck making rent with art." You laughed. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Marcus tried to soften it, tried to reframe years of dismissal as care, saying, "We were just worried about you." But I was done accepting their worry as an excuse for their lack of faith. "No, you were dismissive. You didn't believe in me." My father was trying to recover now, trying to find some way to make this right without actually confronting what they'd done, and he said, "Emma, we're proud of you." And I finished his sentence with the truth he was avoiding. "Now. You're proud now that you see bank statements. Where was that pride before?" The question sat heavy between us, unanswerable because we all knew the truth. And I felt something shift in my chest, a realization that this wasn't really about the intervention at all, but about what it represented, about the fundamental way they'd never seen me clearly. My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face in a way that might have moved me if I wasn't so tired, so done with being the one who had to absorb everyone else's emotions, and she said, "We love you," and I felt my voice soften slightly, but stay firm because love without respect was hollow. "I know you do, but you've never respected me." The silence that followed was complete and devastating, and I let it stretch because they needed to sit with that truth, needed to feel the weight of what they'd done across years of small moments that added up to this enormous gap between who I actually was and who they'd decided I must be. I sat back down because my legs were suddenly shaking with exhaustion, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional weight of finally speaking truths I'd been carrying silently for so long. And I realized there was something else they needed to see. Something that would make the full scope of their misunderstanding finally, devastatingly clear. "I want to show you something else," I said, reaching into my bag one more time and pulling out my day planner. The physical one I kept in addition to my digital calendar because I needed the tactile satisfaction of writing things down, of seeing my commitments in ink on paper where they felt more real. I opened it to the current week and turned it around so they could see the pages covered in my handwriting, every hour blocked out in different colors, client calls and design sessions and consultation meetings filling the days from 8 in the morning until 6 or 7 at night, sometimes later. "This is every week. This is what you thought was me doing nothing." I watched them lean forward to look at the intricate color coding system, the way I'd organized my time with the precision of someone running a serious operation, and I flipped through more pages so they could see it wasn't just this week or this month, but an ongoing pattern, months of meticulous planning stretching behind and ahead of me. Marcus reached out to touch the planner as if he needed physical confirmation that it was real. And his voice carried a note of professional recognition when he said, "Emma, this is more structured than my work schedule." And I felt a bitter satisfaction that at least one of them could finally see the reality of what I'd been doing. "I run a business, alone, no team, no secretary, no support," I said, letting each word land with its full weight. My father was shaking his head, still trying to fit this new information into his understanding of who I was, and he asked, "Why alone? With this income, you could hire help." And I felt the irony of the moment settle over me like a heavy blanket, because this was exactly what I'd come here to share before they'd ambushed me with their intervention. "I'm planning to. I've been interviewing candidates. I was going to tell you all tonight, actually." The silence that followed was thick with the recognition of what they'd stolen from me, this moment I'd been planning, this good news I'd been excited to finally share, and I pulled my laptop from my bag because I needed them to see the full extent of what they'd interrupted with their assumptions and their staged concern. I was excited to finally share good news. I thought maybe this time you'd listen. My mother's "Oh, Emma" came soft and devastated, but I was already opening the presentation I'd prepared, the professional slide deck with projected revenue of $2.5 million for next year, the organizational chart showing 5 positions I was planning to hire for, the photographs of the office space I'd been negotiating to lease in a building downtown with views of the river and room for my growing team. I turned the laptop around and let them scroll through the slides, watched them take in the growth projections and staff positions, and the final slide about the potential book deal with a major publisher, a contract I was negotiating to write about branding strategy for creative professionals. Jake's voice carried disbelief and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine regret when he asked, "You were going to share all this?" And I met his eyes steadily as I answered, "Before you staged an intervention about my spending problem." Bethany said, "We feel terrible, but I wasn't ready to accept their guilt as absolution, wasn't ready to let them off the hook with simple apologies, and I heard the hardness in my own voice when I asked, 'Do you? Or are you just surprised?' Because I needed to know if they actually understood what they'd done, or if they were just shocked by the numbers, impressed by the success, but still not seeing the fundamental way they'd failed to know me." My father's question came quietly, stripped of his earlier authority. "What can we do to make this right?" And I sat with that question for a long moment, feeling the weight of years of dismissal and the uncertainty of whether anything could actually change, or if this would just be another moment they'd forget once the shock wore off. I sat with my father's question for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only seconds, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on me and wondering if real change was even possible, or if this moment would just become another story they told themselves, another way they'd reframe history to avoid confronting their own failures. "I don't know if you can make it right," I said finally, and my mother's face crumpled further as she reached toward me with one hand and said, "Please, we want to try." But I wasn't ready to accept their desire to fix things as evidence they understood what was actually broken. "Do you understand what you did tonight? You ambushed me. You staged an intervention without ever asking me a single question about my actual life." And I watched them exchange glances that suggested they were starting to grasp the magnitude of their assumption, but weren't quite there yet, weren't quite seeing the full scope of what they'd revealed about themselves. Jake started to speak, his voice carrying that familiar tone of justification. "We thought," but I cut him off because that was exactly the problem, the core issue that had to be addressed before anything else could be fixed. "That's the problem. You thought. You assumed. You decided who I was without ever really looking. My voice was getting stronger now, powered by years of being invisible and overlooked and dismissed, and I felt myself standing straighter as I continued. I'm 29 years old. I'm a millionaire. I'm successful by any standard. And my own family thought I was failing. Marcus had the grace to look genuinely stricken as he said, "We were wrong. Clearly, completely wrong." And I appreciated that he at least could state it plainly without hedging or making excuses. But it still wasn't enough because they thought this was about the money when it went so much deeper. It's not about being wrong about the money. It's about being wrong about me. My father leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking older suddenly, diminished by the realization of what he'd done, and he asked, "Tell us how to fix this." And I considered whether I even wanted to give them a roadmap, or if the work of figuring it out should be theirs alone. But I'd never been cruel, had never wanted to punish them even when they'd hurt me, so I took a breath and tried to articulate what I needed. I need you to see me, actually see me, not who you think I am, not who you expected me to be. My mother was nodding through her tears, and I continued because they needed to understand this wasn't just about tonight. I need you to ask about my life instead of assuming. I need you to respect my work even if you don't understand it. I need you to trust that I'm capable of making good decisions. Jake said, "We can do that," with the confidence of someone who thought changing behavior was as simple as deciding to do so, and I felt my skepticism rising because I'd heard promises before, had watched them forget their good intentions as soon as the moment passed. Can you? Because this isn't new. This pattern has been my whole life. I pulled up a memory I'd been carrying for over a decade, one that exemplified everything that had come after. You came to every one of Jake's games. You missed my senior art show, the one where I won the state competition because Marcus had a soccer tournament. My father started to dismiss it the way he always did, the way that had taught me my feelings about the past didn't matter. "Emma, that was years ago," but I wasn't letting him minimize it this time. And it continued. It's still continuing. Tonight is just the culmination. I felt the truth of that settle in my chest, the understanding that this intervention wasn't an aberration, but the logical endpoint of how they'd always seen me. And I realized that what I needed wasn't their apologies, but their commitment to actual, sustained change. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for actual change. I stood up again, because I needed the physical authority that came with standing while they sat. And I felt my voice shift into something more commanding as I said, "I'm going to tell you what needs to happen." And I watched them settle into their seats with an attentiveness that might have been satisfying if this whole situation hadn't been so painful and unnecessary. First, you're going to stop making assumptions about my life. If you're curious about what I'm doing, or how I'm spending my money, or where I'm traveling, you're going to ask me directly, instead of creating narratives based on Instagram posts and neighbor gossip. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. Second, you're going to respect my time. My work schedule is as important as Jake's court dates or Marcus's client meetings. When I say I can't attend something because of work, you're going to trust that I'm making a professional decision, not avoiding family. My mother started to nod, but I wasn't finished. Third, you're going to stop comparing my path to theirs. I'm not a lawyer or an accountant. I'm a creative director. It's different and equally valid, and I need you to understand that different doesn't mean lesser. My mother said, "Of course it is," with the automatic agreement of someone trying to appease, and I felt my frustration spike because this was exactly what I was talking about, the surface-level acknowledgement without real understanding. Say it like you mean it, because you've spent my entire adult life implying otherwise. Bethany shifted in her seat and said, "Emma, we really didn't realize." But I turned to her specifically because there was something that had been festering for a year and needed to be addressed. "You told your kids I'm not successful enough to be a role model. I heard you last Christmas." Her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions, Shock that I'd heard followed by embarrassment followed by the beginning of some excuse, and I watched her mouth open and close as she tried to find words. I was in the kitchen getting more wine when you were talking to my mother in the hallway. You said Jake and Marcus worked hard to get where they are, and you wanted the boys to understand the value of real careers, not Emma's situation. I saw my mother's face turn toward Bethany with something like anger, but I kept my focus on my sister-in-law. I'm the most financially successful person in this family. I did it alone, without family money or connections or anyone's help, starting from nothing and building something substantial through my own work and talent. If that's not worth being a role model, I don't know what is. Jake put his hand on Bethany's arm, whether in support or warning I couldn't tell, and Marcus was staring at the coffee table covered in evidence of my success with an expression I couldn't quite read. I need all of you to understand that your perception of me has been fundamentally wrong, and I need you to be willing to completely revise that perception instead of just adjusting it around the edges. My father cleared his throat and asked the question I'd been waiting for, the one that revealed they still didn't quite understand the scope of what they'd done. Emma, if you've been this successful, why didn't you just tell us? Why keep it a secret? And I felt something shift inside me because this was the moment where I either let them reframe this as my failure to communicate, or I made them understand that I had tried, repeatedly, and they had refused to listen. I didn't keep it a secret, Dad. I tried to share it. Do you remember 3 years ago when I invited you all to my studio? My mother's face went blank, searching for the memory, and I could see she didn't remember because it hadn't been important to her. I had just signed my first six-figure contract. I was so excited I could barely sleep. I invited everyone over because I wanted to celebrate with my family. I ordered catering, had champagne, printed out the contract to show you. Jake was shaking his head slowly, and I couldn't tell if he didn't remember or didn't want to. Marcus, you canceled because you had a client dinner. Jake, you and Bethany said you couldn't find a babysitter. Mom, Dad, you came for 20 minutes, looked around, said it was nice that I was keeping busy, and left to go to Jake's firm event. I watched my father's face as the memory returned to him, saw the moment he realized what he'd done. I stood in that studio surrounded by catering for 12 people, completely alone, and that was when I understood that my success would never matter to you the way theirs did. Marcus looked like I'd physically struck him, and maybe in a way I had, but these were truths that needed to be spoken if anything was going to change. The following year, I sent you all a newsletter I'd created about my business growth. Not one of you mentioned receiving it. I brought it up at Thanksgiving, and Mom asked if I was still doing the design thing. My voice was steady, but I could feel the emotion underneath, years of small rejections that had accumulated into something massive. I invited you to a panel I spoke on at Northwestern about creative entrepreneurship. Dad, you said you'd try to make it but had a golf game. That panel led to 3 major contracts and got me featured in Forbes. I pulled out my phone and opened the article, turned it toward them so they could see my photo, and the headline about rising stars in creative consulting. This article has my full financial breakdown, my client list, everything. It was published 18 months ago. I texted the link to the family group chat. No one responded. Bethany was crying now, and I felt a strange detachment watching her tears because this wasn't about making them feel guilty. It was about making them understand that their perception of my secrecy was actually their pattern of dismissal. So when you ask why I didn't tell you, what you're really asking is why I eventually stopped trying to tell you, and the answer is because I got tired of being invisible. I needed them to understand that this wasn't just about tonight, that this intervention was simply the most obvious manifestation of a problem that had existed my entire life, and I felt the weight of every dismissal and every rolled eye and every condescending pat on the head as I said, "If that's not worth being a role model, I don't know what is." And I watched Bethany's face crumble with the realization of what she'd said and what it meant. Jake put his hand on Bethany's arm, but I couldn't tell if he was comforting her or warning her to stay quiet. And part of me felt guilty for causing her obvious distress, but a larger part of me felt vindicated, because these truths needed to be spoken. These wounds needed to be exposed, if there was any chance of them healing. I need all of you to understand that your perception of me has been fundamentally wrong, I continued, and I made sure to make eye contact with each of them as I spoke. And I need you to be willing to completely revise that perception instead of just adjusting it around the edges or adding a footnote that says, "Oh, Emma has money now, so I guess she's okay." My father shifted in his seat, and I could see him preparing to say something, probably something meant to be conciliatory, and I held up my hand to stop him because I wasn't finished, and I needed them to hear all of it. I need you to understand that I've been building something real and substantial and important while you've been treating me like a child playing dress-up in the adult world. And my voice caught slightly on those words because they cut so close to how I'd felt for so many years. Like I was pretending to be a professional while the real adults, my brothers with their law degrees and accounting certifications, did the actual important work. I need you to go back through your memories and recognize how many times I tried to share my success with you, how many times I invited you into my world, and how many times you declined or dismissed it or forgot about it entirely because it didn't fit your narrative of who I was supposed to be. Marcus was nodding slowly, and I could see his accountant brain working through the implications, probably calculating exactly how successful I'd have to be to accumulate this level of wealth at my age, probably realizing that it represented not luck or a windfall, but sustained exceptional performance over several years. When I invited you to my studio opening, I wasn't asking you to come see my hobby space. I was asking you to witness a major milestone in a serious career, I said. And I felt the old hurt of that day rising up, standing in that beautiful studio space with catering going cold and champagne going flat, because no one I love thought it was important enough to show up for, say. When I sent you the Forbes article, I wasn't bragging. I was trying to show you that outside our family, in the actual professional world, people recognize my work as valuable and significant. My mother was crying harder now, and my father had his arm around her, and Bethany was staring at her hands, and my brothers were both looking at me with expressions I'd never seen before, something like respect, mixed with regret, mixed with confusion about how they'd gotten everything so wrong. I stood there watching them process everything I'd said, all the boundaries I'd drawn, and the truths I'd exposed, and I realized that this moment right here was the actual turning point, not the bank statements, or the tax returns, or the Forbes article, but this moment where I was finally standing up for myself and demanding to be seen as I actually was, rather than as they'd always assumed me to be. I need you to understand that going forward, our relationship has to be different, I said, and my voice was steady now, all the emotion channeled into clarity and purpose. Because I can't keep living in this dynamic where my achievements are invisible until they're so undeniable that you're forced to acknowledge them, and even then you're more shocked than proud, more concerned with how you missed it than with celebrating what I actually accomplished. My father opened his mouth to respond, but I kept going because I needed them to hear all of it, needed them to understand the full scope of what had to change. Fourth, you're going to stop treating my career choices as less legitimate than traditional paths, and that means no more jokes about artists not making money, no more suggestions that I get a real job, no more dismissive comments about working from home or setting my own hours. Jake was nodding slowly, and I could see him actually listening, actually trying to understand. And I felt a small flicker of hope that maybe this could actually lead to real change rather than just temporary shame that would fade back into old patterns. Fifth, when I share professional news with you, you're going to engage with it the same way you engage with Jake's cases or Marcus's clients, which means asking follow-up questions and showing genuine interest and remembering the details when I mention them again months later. My mother was still crying, but she was also nodding, and I could see her mentally reviewing all the times she'd failed to do exactly what I was describing, all the times she'd smiled and changed the subject when I mentioned my work. And finally, most importantly, you're going to trust that I know what I'm doing with my life, my career, and my finances, and unless I specifically ask for advice or help, you're going to respect that I'm a capable adult who has proven herself more than capable of managing her own affairs. I let that sit for a moment, watching each of their faces, trying to gauge whether they truly understood or whether they were just agreeing because they felt guilty and shocked. These aren't negotiable, I added, and I made sure my voice carried the weight of that statement. Because if we can't have a relationship built on mutual respect, then I'd rather have distance than continue with what we've had, which is me constantly trying to prove myself worthy of basic acknowledgement, while you all remain convinced I'm perpetually on the verge of failure. Marcus looked at our parents and then back at me, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but sincere. Emma, I hear you, and I'm sorry, and I want to do better, but I also need you to help me understand how to do that, because clearly everything I thought I knew about your life was wrong. It was the most honest thing any of them had said all night, an admission not just of being wrong, but of needing to learn. And I felt some of my defensive armor start to crack, because this was what I'd needed all along, someone willing to admit they didn't know and needed to be taught rather than continuing to assume and dismiss.